Potobo was a neighborhood. Streets, houses, a school, 2,050 buildings standing on solid ground. Then, in less than a minute, it wasn't there anymore. Not burned, not blown up, not swept away by a wave. The ground it was built on simply stopped being solid and swallowed it whole. On September 28, 2018, a 7.5 magnitude earthquake struck the island of Sulawesi, Indonesia, near the city of Palu. What followed in the next 60 minutes killed 4,340 people through an earthquake, a tsunami nobody was warned about in time. And a phenomenon most people have never even heard of. The earth itself turning to liquid and swallowing entire neighborhoods alive. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how solid ground can behave like water, and why the very system built to save Palu's people ended up telling them it was safe, minutes after it wasn't. This is the story of the day science, geography, and a broken alarm system collided in one bay in Indonesia and rewrote what seismologists thought they knew about which earthquakes to fear. At around 3 in the afternoon on September 28, 2018, the ground beneath central Sulawesi trembled with a magnitude 6.1 earthquake. It was strong enough to send people into the streets, but it was only a warning shot. Palu, a coastal city on the edge of a narrow, funnel-shaped bay, had reason to be distracted that day. It was the 40th anniversary of the city's founding, and along Talise Beach the government was running the Palu Nomoni festival, a stretch of celebration nearly 3.8 kilometers long, packed with families enjoying the evening air. For the next 3 hours, the Palu-Koro Fault kept slipping. 27 aftershocks rippled through the ground. Then, at 18:03 local time, the fault let go for real. A magnitude 7.5 earthquake, just 10 kilometers deep, tearing south underneath Palu Bay itself. Here's what almost nobody in Palu knew that evening. This type of earthquake, a strike-slip quake, where the ground moves sideways rather than up and down, isn't supposed to be a major tsunami threat. The textbook says, a strike-slip fault mostly shakes you. It doesn't usually drown you. The Palu-Koro Fault isn't some obscure crack in the earth. Either, it's one of the most active fault systems in Indonesia, slicing directly through the valley that Palu sits in, a city built, quite literally, on top of the fault line itself. The textbook was about to be wrong, in the worst way possible, for the people still walking that beach. Within 7 to 12 minutes of the main shock, a wall of water hit the Palu Bay coastline. Indonesia's meteorological agency, BMKG, had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It issued a tsunami warning within minutes of the earthquake. Officials modelled the expected wave at around 2 meters. Manageable, survivable, if people got off the beach. The real wave arrived at 5 to 6 meters, nearly 3 times taller than predicted. That's a wall of water roughly as tall as a 2-story house, moving at speed, funneling into a narrow bay that acted like a nozzle and made everything worse. And then came the part almost nobody has heard about. 30 minutes after issuing the warning, BMKG cancelled it. The tsunami had already struck the coast 15 minutes earlier. Why would anyone cancel a warning after the wave had already hit? Because they didn't know it had. The tide gauge BMKG used to verify the danger was 300 kilometers away, in a town called Mamuju. Palu's own tsunami sensors, the ones actually built to detect a wave in the bay, had been destroyed by the earthquake itself. Phone lines into Palu were down. The people responsible for warning the city were flying blind, reading data from a gauge 300 kilometers away about a wave that had already killed people. That means the earthquake didn't just create the tsunami, it also destroyed the alarm system meant to warn people about it in the same 60 seconds. Scientists studying the rupture afterward found another reason the wave outperformed every prediction. The earthquake moved through the Palu-Koro Fault as what's called a super shear rupture. The crack in the crust travelled faster than the seismic shear waves it was generating, an unusually violent and rare mechanism. Combine that speed with underwater landslides likely triggered inside the bay itself, and you get a wave that no strike-slip model was built to predict. But the wave, as devastating as it was, wasn't even the worst thing that happened in Palu that day. 10 kilometers from the coastline, in 2 ordinary neighborhoods called Potobo and Balaroa, something even stranger was happening. The ground itself was turning into liquid. It's called soil liquefaction, and here's the science in plain terms. Some ground is basically loose sand and soil sitting in water, close to the surface. Shake that ground violently enough, and the water pressure between the grains spikes so high that the soil grains lose contact with each other. The ground stops behaving like a solid. It starts behaving like a thick, flowing liquid, with houses, roads, and people sitting on top of it. In Balaroa, liquefaction swallowed approximately 375 buildings across 40 hectares. That's roughly 56 football fields of neighborhood, gone, with the ground in places dropping nearly 2 full stories into a fresh crater. In Potobo, it was even larger. Roughly 2,050 buildings sank or were dragged across 180 hectares, close to 250 football fields of houses, streets, and yards, consumed by moving earth in a matter of minutes. Researchers who studied the event afterward called it one of the largest liquefaction disasters ever documented in a populated area, a real-world case study that geotechnical engineers now use to teach the phenomenon. This wasn't a flood. It wasn't a landslide sliding downhill. The ground directly underneath thousands of people simply stopped being ground. If a moment like that deserves to be understood in full, not just skimmed past, stick with this one to the end. It gets more human from here. Azran was feeding his goats in Balaroa when the shaking started. He watched a chunk of his own neighborhood physically break away from the rest. When the ground finally stopped moving, his house cracked, but still standing, sat on the rim of a crater that hadn't existed minutes earlier. The mud came from underneath, lifted all the buildings, then sucked them down, he said. It seemed as though the ground was on a roller coaster. In Potobo, a man named Aswar went looking for his own home afterward and couldn't find it. The mud flattened the house, he said. I don't know where the house is anymore. All the walls and roofs are gone. I can only see one of the cupboards standing there. Haji Duddy, a 48-year-old carpenter, was carrying his father on his back as he ran. I saw the road open up, he said. The street looked like a wave of water. He described houses exploding around him as he fled, torn apart by the pressure of the ground moving beneath them. A high school student, Pragati Weera Nur Sabina, heard a roaring sound outside her home before the walls buckled. It looks like a wave in the ocean, she said, watching the houses in her neighborhood get swept away not by water, but by earth behaving like water. And 10 kilometers away, at almost the exact same hour, families at the Palu Nomoni festival were still on Talise Beach, some still strolling the sand, unaware that the ground beneath 2 neighborhoods across the bay was actively swallowing them, and unaware a wave taller than a house was minutes from the shore they stood on. 2 disasters. 1 city. The same 60 minutes. There was no time for the 2 stories to warn each other. The people on the beach didn't know about Potobo. The people in Potobo, fighting to stay above ground that no longer held still, had no idea a wave was about to hit the coast they couldn't even see from where they stood. Palu was being attacked by its own geography from 2 directions at once, and nobody in the city had the full picture until it was already over. When the counting was finally done, 4,340 people were confirmed dead, more people than live in many small towns, gone in a single evening. 2,141 of those deaths were inside Palu city itself. Another 10,679 people were injured. 667 people were officially listed as missing. More than 1,000 bodies recovered from the disaster were never identified. Many of the missing were never found at all, believed still buried beneath the hardened ground in Potobo and Balaroa, where the liquefied earth eventually resettled and solidified again, sealing shut over whatever it had pulled under. Across the region, roughly 68,500 buildings were damaged or destroyed. That means an entire mid-sized city's worth of homes, shops, and schools was wiped off the map or left unlivable in the span of one earthquake and its aftermath. It became the deadliest earthquake to strike Indonesia since the 2006 Yogyakarta earthquake, and the deadliest earthquake anywhere in the world that year. Rescue crews faced a problem most earthquake responses don't. How do you dig for survivors in ground that behaved like liquid hours earlier and could, in theory, do it again? Heavy equipment had to move carefully across terrain that looked solid on the surface, but had already proven it wasn't. In places, officials eventually made the difficult decision to declare parts of Potobo and Balaroa as mass graves rather than continue excavating. The ground itself had become the burial site, and pulling it apart risked more collapse than recovery. The Palu disaster didn't just kill thousands of people. It broke a scientific assumption. Strike-slip earthquakes weren't supposed to generate tsunamis this destructive, but the narrow, funnel-shaped geometry of Palu Bay turned a low-risk fault type into a wave that outran every prediction seismologists had on record. It's also become one of the defining case studies in tsunami early warning failure, a textbook example of what happens when the sensors meant to protect a city are destroyed by the very earthquake they're supposed to detect. And in engineering classrooms, Potobo and Balaroa, the 2 neighborhoods that swallowed a combined 425 buildings across 220 hectares in minutes, are now cited as some of the clearest real-world proof of how catastrophic liquefaction can be when a city is built on the wrong kind of ground. Azran's cracked house, still perched on the rim of that fresh crater when he first told his story, is the kind of image geologists keep coming back to: solid ground and the rubble of a life, sitting on opposite sides of a line that wasn't supposed to exist. Palu didn't just lose 2 neighborhoods and a beach full of festivalgoers that day. It rewrote what the rest of the world thought it knew about which earthquakes to fear, and where the ground itself can no longer be trusted to simply hold still. If you want more real disasters explained with the actual science behind them, not just the headlines. The next one is already being researched.